Alrighty, everybody. Bienvenidos a todos. Good afternoon. My name is Mark Chavez, the chair of the Hispano-Philanthropic Society, and I'd like to thank you for taking time today to join us for this wonderful conversation on policies and issues facing our Hispanic students and families. It is always great to see our HPS members and welcome new friends, and we appreciate your continued support during the coronavirus pandemic. A few housekeeping rules for today. Please put your name and company in the chat box to say hello. Remember to mute your microphone if you are not speaking. Place any questions that you have in the chat box. And if interested in learning more about HPS, please put your name, number, or email address in the chat box, and we will follow up with you. The session is also going to be recorded. So with further ado, let me introduce you to today's moderator. Amanda Aragon was born and raised in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and is a graduate of Rio Rancho High School. She attended the University of Tulsa, where she obtained a degree in international business and Spanish. After working in the private sector, Amanda pursued public service at the New Mexico Public Education Department. After leaving there, continuing her passion for service and education, Amanda developed and created New Mexico Kids Can, where she now serves as the founding executive director and is currently an HPS council member. I will now turn it over to Amanda.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you everyone for joining. We're so excited to have you today and really excited to bring this conversation to you. If you have attended one of these meetings in the past, you know that we usually have them right after the legislative session, but 2020 has been a crazy year. And honestly, this conversation that we plan to have today is more relevant than ever. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Gabriel Sanchez. Many of you know Gabe. If you don't, you should know Gabe. He is incredible, a wonderful asset to the New Mexico community. I could read his bio, but I will not do it justice. The things that you need to know about Gabe are that he is a professor and is doing amazing work at the University of New Mexico. He's a researcher. He's the principal at Latino Decisions. He's on the forefront of political polling, and you've probably seen him on your TV on any number of news stations across the United States of America. I think he has fantastic dance skills, and he's always the life of the party. But today, Gabe is here to share with us some incredible work that Latino Decisions have done over the last couple of months and really set the stage about what our Hispanic families and students are facing as we head into a new school year. So without further ado, Dr. Gabriel Sanchez.
Thank you, Amanda, for that great opening. I appreciate the opportunity to connect with many of you. Seeing you all just uplifts me quite a bit at a very dark time where all of us are struggling. And unfortunately, the presentation I'm going to provide today isn't going to be the rosiest. It's a lot of data really displaying the challenges that our Hispanic community across the state of New Mexico is facing right now due to COVID. My wife, Anna, and I have been part of the HPS since its founding, so anything United Way, HPS asks of us, we're always willing to participate however we can. And hopefully this data will be useful for a larger conversation about what we all can collectively do to help address some of these gaping needs that we're going to see with the data. I'd like to thank a host of organizations you see here, hopefully on the slide deck, that commissioned this study at a time where data was really limited on how Hispanic families in New Mexico were dealing with this impact, as well as looking towards the education system and what Hispanic families needed as we were shifting to where we are now, the start of the school year. So those organizations all worked together quickly to commission the study and have made this data available to anybody who's interested in learning more about it. So thank you all, this host of organizations. So I'm gonna jump right into this. I'm gonna try to be relatively brief with my presentation so that hopefully there's a lot of time for Q&A and the panel that will follow. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about the methodology. Note that this slide deck, a longer version, and a bunch of reports and briefs are available on Latino Decisions webpage. So those of you that are interested in learning more about it, you can go there, latinodecisions.com. Tag me if you have any follow-up questions. But you see, we interviewed just under 500 Hispanic parents or grandparents with children 18 years of age or younger to really learn more about how COVID-19 has created challenges specifically for our Hispanic families in the state. I say both parents and grandparents, because 16% of the sample were grandparents who indicated to us that they are stepping up and serving as the primary caregivers at a difficult time when a lot of parents have to be outside of their homes working or trying to work from home. We use a blended approach at Latino Decisions to cast as wide a net possible to make sure that the data is representative of Hispanic families in New Mexico. So that was done in this context with landlines, cell phones, as well as web-based interviews, conducted always fully bilingually in English or Spanish at the respondent's preference. And I'll say that in the context of these 480 completed interviews, 165 of those were with immigrant families. So we wanted to make sure that we had a representation of all Hispanics across the state, including those who are Spanish dominant and who may be foreign born. We weighted the data back to the census to make sure it was representative of the population, and you see it was conducted from June 4th through June 12th. The long survey averaged 20 minutes in length, so I'm going to provide just a little bit of an overview hitting some of the high points, but note there's a lot more data you can dig into on our webpage. So jumping right into it, first question we asked in this survey was an open-ended one. We asked families directly, thinking about your children's education, what are the most important issues you think government should address, and basically allowed folks to tell us in their own words what were the most pressing issues. Folks could give up to any 2 responses. So you see out the gate, when we combine those who said access to quality childcare, as well as access to daycare or early learning, that 41% is indicative of the fact that this survey indicates that roughly half of all Hispanic parents or grandparents are essential employees working outside of the house. So how do those folks manage doing that without having access to childcare, right? That's going to be one issue we'll come back to as a major theme. Another one is access to the internet or technology at 29%. That's going to be another theme that I'll hit home with a few specific data points. And then information. One of the themes we're going to say is Hispanic families want more information, specifically from school districts, about their children's education. And finally, help with online education, right? That's the topic of the day, as many of us are transitioning back to school, whether it's in a hybrid model, whether it's fully online. Getting help with this is going to be one of the themes that the survey really touches on in much more depth. One of the big picture take-home messages is, unfortunately, you see over 80% of Hispanic households right now are very worried that their children are spending too much time away from school and or not learning enough from online schooling. And they're really worried that their children might be falling behind. I'm sure I'm not the only person in my network who have a lot of folks reaching out to me and asking difficult questions. Should they hold their children back a year? How should they handle distance learning? How do they track whether or not their kids are learning at an adequate rate? And I think the survey bears this out, right? You see essentially 81% are either somewhat or very concerned, 52% very concerned that their children are falling behind. When we followed up and we asked those folks, what subject areas are you most concerned about? Again, that your children are falling behind in, you see overwhelmingly math was the subject area with the greatest level of concern at 64%, followed by 48% who indicated science was the subject area they're most concerned about their children falling behind in. And when we ask folks, you know, are there any subject areas you feel inadequate to be able to directly help your children with as we're thinking about distance learning, you see very similar trends. 57% of respondents indicated math was a subject area that's the most difficult for them to be able to help their children with at home, 39% indicating science. So thinking about what can we do to help, right? Finding ways to connect families with whether it's tutoring, whether it's one-on-one support, specifically in math and science, is going to be something we all need to collectively think about. One positive, and I think this speaks to how hard our folks in our education departments here in the state of New Mexico have worked at trying to tackle this. We see that 80% of our families are basically approve of the way their district or their school has handled this transition at a very difficult time. So I think I want to stress that our public education department, we were able to brief them, their leadership with this survey. They're doing a great job in very difficult situations, and it's all of us to try to fill some of these gaps that they can't do in the difficult times that they're facing with difficult budget challenges. Thinking about this transition back to school and what we can do to make things safe, we asked parents and grandparents directly what would make them feel more comfortable, especially thinking about potentially going back in a hybrid model or having some in-person. And fortunately, a lot of our school districts are meeting the challenge and already taking precautions and doing a lot of these things. 87% support having classrooms extensively cleaned every day and requiring everybody, teachers, students, staff, to all wear masks, to prevent the spread of the virus. You also see 83% support staggering school days to reduce class sizes. So take-home message is that Hispanic families are very comfortable and flexible, trying to make anything possible to help their children become educated and continue not falling behind. That includes potentially mixing in-person attendance with distance learning, again, over 80% support, and even close to 70% of families support extending the school year if necessary to help their kids catch up with their studies. Again, recognizing that falling behind is a great concern. Continuing with distance learning only, if that's needed, 63% support. So my interpretation is it's not as though families are really hoping to have distance learning for this full semester or even considering the full school year, but they recognize the challenge with COVID-19 right now and will support having to go to that model if it's necessary. And finally, you see over 60% support longer school days to help kids some gradual homeschooling. Again, major theme being parents are concerned their children are falling behind. They will do anything in their power to help address that from their end. You already saw one of the challenges was really having basic access to the internet. Those of us that study this know, unfortunately, New Mexico has some of the highest percentages of our population, Hispanic population included, that lack basic access to the internet, right? And you see that borne out in this poll. 21% of all Hispanic families across the state indicate they do not have regular and stable access to the net at home. That's even higher at 30% for our immigrant families, right? That's almost 1 in every 3 immigrant families that are Hispanic across the state not having reliable access to the internet. Right? You have another sizable segment who indicate that their only access to the internet is through their smartphone. So as we're all thinking about distance learning and utilizing all these apps, how do you do that if your only access is through the cell phone? Right? Again, New Mexicans, we know this challenge. I will stress, as I have been, that COVID-19 did not create these inequalities and basic access to the internet. It's just shedding a much greater light on that existing gaping inequality that, in my opinion, it's time to do something about. Right? I think folks, particularly in our rural areas of the state, are suffering from this at a much greater extent than those of us that live in metro areas. When we think about specific challenges, just hitting a few bullet points on the larger survey, 74% of Hispanic families indicated it's much more difficult to communicate with their teachers right now. And so thinking about how do we make that more accessible to them, right, at a very difficult time where we're hearing over and over again from the survey, communication is highly valuable to these families. 50% do not have enough computers, tablets, or laptops for everyone in their family. Again, remember, many of our Hispanic households have multiple children in the home. So even if you do have a tablet or a computer, how do you utilize that one machine for multiple children who might be able to use it for distance learning, as well as folks that are having to work from home right now? So not having enough equipment is a major theme. And also the technical problems, such as websites or programs, Zoom, all these different platforms. As more of us are trying to tap into that, obviously it comes with challenges. And unfortunately, many of our Hispanic households are new to this technology. So trying to find ways to connect them with support is going to be vital for all of us to ensure that they're able to keep up and continue distance learning for their children. When we ask specifically what would help you to continue your children's learning in the fall, you see, not surprisingly, given the challenges we see from the last slide, 62% indicated having a computer provided by the school because they don't have enough at home. Again, fortunately, many of our school districts are meeting this challenge and finding paths to get computers into the hands of our households, which is great. However, we also have to keep in mind 75% of Hispanic households indicated updated software that will actually sync with that computer is critical. I heard that a lot from open-ended respondents in this survey who indicated it was great that they got a computer, but oftentimes that computer wasn't up to date with the software to actually use the apps that the school was asking of them. So again, how do we help folks? How do we connect them with the help and support, whether that's technical or with the specific software, to be able to ensure that the computer that they have actually syncs with what they're being asked to do at home? A lot of concern with virtual learning, not surprising given all the challenges that we laid out. 76% of respondents, even that far back in June, were very concerned about virtual learning and distance education. And it's not surprising given a lot of folks had difficult challenges trying to navigate that when we thought about breaking out into COVID-19 when it started. Hopefully now School districts, schools, teachers have all worked very hard to make this a lot easier transition, but we already recognize for a lot of folks, they're gonna need a lot of extra support to be able to make that happen at home. I think all of us need to be thinking about what areas we can fill gaps with that schools are gonna have challenges doing, whether it's from budget or being spread thin themselves. Not surprising, more communication on assignments and child's performance is vital. More in-person time with teachers, and folks recognize that might have to be more in-person time done virtually, but they want that one-on-one time support with their young ones to be able to have direct access to teachers. One strategy that I'm seeing working across the board from folks I'm talking with is by having open hours, office hours with the teacher for one-on-one time, and allow parents to participate in that. In some cases, they need support themselves, whether that's on the subject matter or with technology. So having that dual approach of one-on-one tutoring available, but also includes the parents. Thinking about this from a multi-generational perspective, I think will have much greater impact than just thinking about the children alone in that enterprise. Transitioning to another major theme of the survey was, unfortunately, not only are Hispanic families having difficulties with distance learning and education, but we're seeing incredibly difficult economic times from our families across the state. Those of you that pay attention to the news, this won't be surprising to you, but hopefully having some specific data points from our Hispanic families will give us some standpoint of what we might be able to do to help. So again, thinking about an open-ended question, we asked folks, what are the most important issues facing your community that government should address? Open-ended, folks could tell us whatever they wanted in their own words. You see a range of issues from improved access to food, medicine, and basic services or resources to information about COVID-19. But I want to draw your attention to the modal outcome. 31%, so roughly 1 in 3 of our respondents indicated help with wages and income was the most important issue that they were facing, even beyond the health challenges that many of our households are facing right now due to COVID. Following up with that, in my opinion, maybe the most sobering statistic that I'll share with you today, when we asked the full sample, how much did they have in resources for emergencies like this as a safety net? You see nearly half of Hispanic families across the state have $1,000 or less for emergencies right now. Given that we conducted this in early June, I can tell you almost all of those folks have used up any availability of their safety net to be able to deal with the difficult challenges that they're facing right now. So thinking about the tough economic times that Hispanic families are facing, many of them without access to any federal relief because of their immigration status, is something we should all be thinking about. And again, in my opinion, is maybe the most important and most sobering data point that I'll share with you today. As a consequence of this financial strain that families are under right now, we see that many are facing very difficult decisions. 38% already indicating in June that they used up all or most of their savings, 24% postponing or cutting back on health-related expenses, not getting the preventative care that they know they need, 24% skipping a monthly car rent or mortgage payment. Fortunately, we see 24% have been able to borrow money from friends and family, but I want to draw your attention to the 18% who indicated, unfortunately, that they've had to borrow money from a payday or easy loan company in this difficult time. We know, unfortunately, that New Mexico has very weak laws on this particular issue, and consequently, these folks that are having to turn to this difficult avenue are going to be in an even more difficult and dire financial situation within a matter of months because of the escalated interest rates that many of these folks charge to be able to lend out money at this very difficult time. One thing that jumps out at you, as I already noted, roughly half of all our Hispanic families, that includes both parents and grandparents, are continuing to work outside of the home as essential employees. So the take-home message is, and you can see the different industries that our folks are working in right now, Hispanic families, just because of our sheer population size, are essentially helping to keep the economy afloat at this very difficult time. But again, all of these folks are parents of children 18 years of age or younger. So how do they continue to be essential employees and work outside of the home when we're seeing, unfortunately, limited access to daycare, limited access to quality childcare? I think that has to be something we directly address, because these folks can't do it both ways. They can't continue to keep the economy afloat and also, unfortunately, not have opportunities to have quality childcare for their own kids. And final theme, we were blessed to be able to add some content on views of Hispanic families right now regarding police brutality and criminal justice reform at a time where almost every day, unfortunately, we're seeing greater and greater evidence that there's significant need for reform across the country and unfortunately here in New Mexico. When we ask folks directly, as far as you know, have your children watch the video footage showing the police officer placing his knee on Mr. Floyd, you see high levels of reported viewership among our children. 46% watched the video with their children themselves. Another 21% indicated that their child has watched the video on their own, right? And 32% are not exactly sure, but we know, right, our children are sponges. They're seeing these images and they're not equipped emotionally to be able to handle what they're viewing, unfortunately, on the nightly news. And Mr. Floyd obviously is not an isolated incident. We're seeing continued examples even this week of additional footage of, unfortunately, police officers killing African Americans. And let's not forget that our Hispanic community faces many of these same challenges. Here, the news rolls have focused on, unfortunately, police brutality and police killings in our own backyard. News examples out of the New York Times indicate, unfortunately, Las Cruces, New Mexico has one of the highest rates of police brutality towards the citizenry, and that's just down the street in Las Cruces. So fortunately, we found that 82% of Hispanic households have used this video as an opportunity to speak with their children about racism and structural bias. I think, again, because our children are sponges, they're soaking up this information, the more all of us can do to remember that and use this as an opportunity to educate that next generation so that hopefully they're not living through these same phenomenon when they're adults. Leave you with these last two data points. When we think about this particular issue, the survey makes clear that Hispanic families across the state of New Mexico stand in unison and solidarity with the African American community, as you see, due to shared experiences, right? 89% of our survey respondents agreed with the statement, I can understand the pain and frustration that the Black community feels right now with law enforcement because Latinos face similar experience with law enforcement. I'll leave you with this. 26% of our sample reports that someone in their household directly has been the victim of excessive force by police. 26%, that's 1 in 4 Hispanic households across the state of New Mexico. So hopefully the survey has given you something to think about, right, as we jump into this larger conversation with our panel. Don't hesitate to email me if you have any follow-up questions or any insights or questions about this data or any of the others that we're collecting right now at Latino Decisions. Thank you very much.
Gabe, thank you so much for that. I know for those, I know how deeply everyone on this call cares about our community. So I know those statistics are oftentimes really challenging to hear. And I think to echo Gabe's comments, we should challenge ourselves to push systems to deliver results for these families and our students. And we should push ourselves to see what we can bring to the table as a collective community to support our students and families. And that's what we'll be talking about with our panelists today. So we have a couple of questions for our panelists to begin with, but if you have questions that you'd like the panel to answer, please either send them to me directly in the messages or post them for everyone, and we'll do our best to, I will do my best as moderator to get those questions to our panelists. I will begin by introducing Senator Jacob Candelaria. Again, all of our panelists today, incredible people, so excited to have them. Senator Candelaria is obviously a New Mexico senator. He's also the president of the Hispanic Bar Association and has done some groundbreaking work in the Senate. We are also joined by Representative Kelly Fajardo. Representative Fajardo is from Valencia County, represents Valencia County in the New Mexico House of Representatives, and is a business owner herself. And we are joined by Deputy Secretary Warren Perea, who is the Deputy Secretary of Teaching and Learning at the Public Education Department, and in my opinion, oversees the most important parts of the Public Education Department, everything that relates to teaching and learning, which right now she is juggling a lot. So thank you all for being with us today. And we are going to kick off with a question to ease into the conversation, which is, tell us a little bit about this last legislative session, how it went, and what we might expect for the 2021 legislative session. And I will let you guys duke it out to see who jumps in first.
So I guess I'll take that on. So when we left the session, it was pre-COVID. And we also had a large surplus. We were, living large. Things were looking good in the state. We had a lot of money to spend. Oil and gas was doing great. And then from now until then, we are dealing with a world pandemic. We went into this special session to fix a budget shortfall because oil and gas has dropped. I even believe at one day in particular. And so everybody understands, our 35 to 45% of our entire state budget comes from oil and gas in this state. So when those prices fall, it affects everything. And I think there was actually one day where the oil and gas prices were so bad, it actually went to a negative dollar amount. And so that's kind of where we left it, leaving the session. And now we're kind of in we're in a whole different world where we're trying to figure out how we're going to move forward.
Yeah, I agree with the representative. I'll focus in on the special session. You know, we took some budget action to balance the books, to close out the last fiscal year. And the current fiscal year that we're in now, you know, we were able, because of significant reserves, to avoid, you know, dramatic cuts to public services and public education this last special session. What I'll let everyone know, though, and I am concerned about it, the LFC budget recommendation to date, they've basically advised all agencies to prepare for at least a 5% budget reduction, which in real terms, some agencies actually would not be that hurt by that because they saw such dramatic spending increases over the last 2 fiscal years. Like, so for example, the Environment Department last year got, I think, a double-digit increase during the regular session. And a 5% reduction for them is essentially still a 5% increase. But in other areas of government, especially higher education and public education and Medicaid, even a 2 to 3% reduction, I think, is very challenging, and is going to be very challenging, I think, when, quite frankly, when a very different and new Senate caucus comes in January, whether or not the new Senate caucus will actually agree with the budget recommendations of LFC, which basically at this point contemplate no revenue increases. And let's just call it for what it is, a tax increase, and would balance the budget solely by cuts to services. And, you know, I appreciate the different views on how we get ourselves out of this. But what I will say is that there's no way that we will simply tighten our belts to get out of this budget situation. This is much worse than tightening your belts. So if any amount of tax increase or tax adjustments are not on the table, we are not just talking about tightening belts. We're talking about very real, very deep cuts to public spending. And we can all have very reasonable debates about that. And I respect everyone's views on those sort of issues. What I will say, though, is during the last recession, and this was some economic data that we were just reviewing, even though the federal government at a federal level was pumping trillions of dollars into the US economy, the reductions in government spending at the state and local level, right? States have balanced budget amendments like we do. We have to live within our means. The Federal Reserve has said that decreases in state and local government spending actually contributed in 2011 and in 2012 in each of those years to a 0.7% reduction in national GDP, meaning it had a very significant impact on the contraction of the size of the economy and on the economy's recovery. And so I think next session, we're going to face some very important and fundamental decisions about how we as a state grow out of this crisis and come out the other side stronger. But I think it is going to take some very challenging discussions, and make no mistake, the scope of the problem we face and how we tackle it will really define the next 10 years in our state. It will define a generation. how we respond to these challenges now that we, for some reason, have been tasked with solving, will really define our state's trajectory. So it will be a very consequential session in January, and will also be a session where you have a lot of new members and a lot of new leadership, especially in the Senate, in very important areas like the Senate Finance Committee, the Senate Corporations Committee, the Senate President Pro Tempore. It is a new day in the Senate.
Thank you, Senator. Deputy Secretary, is there anything you'd like to comment on in reflection of the last legislative session and what's upcoming in 2021?
Sure. Well, first I'll start and say thank you, Amanda, very much for moderating this. Thank you, Dr. Sanchez. It's wonderful to hear this second time around. Great. And thank you to the Hispano Philanthropic Society. This is wonderful just to be with everyone. Thank you, Representative Fajardo and Senator Candelaria, very much. You know, from the perspective of a state agency, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we try our best to really partner with the legislature. You know, they lead us a lot in funding and in how we might approach. And so I think that the partnership is really, I can't stress enough, so critical and important moving forward within this next session. And we've inherited that partnership. I think it's been strong thus far, but it will be even more so, speaking eloquently to what Senator Candelaria just kind of alluded to, then the decisions that have to be made moving forward. I will say that from the perspective of a public education department, you know, we see two things happening. One, the implication of decisions that will be made in terms of budget can be looked at kind of top down from a macro level, but really become very, very clear when you look at it at a student level. And how are these, you know, decisions that we make impacting the one student in that one classroom and his family or her family? And I think that when you contextualize it like that, it becomes very real, very suddenly. Yeah. And then from there you grow it to, and then how is this impacting educators and the LEA, the charter, or the school district itself? In that 5% proposed reduction, right? How do we as a state agency protect those students, those families, and or those districts best? What are the decisions that we have to own ourselves and consider in terms of our budget and the state agency budget versus the budget that runs out through the PED, that flows through the PED to the districts, right? Because I'm not sure everyone understands or knows that mechanism. There's the flow through, the above the line funding that goes directly to the districts. It's the bulk of the funding from the legislature that goes out. And then there's an additional funding that goes to the state agency. Now the tension in that will be really important for us all to consider and think about is the lawsuit. So we have a lawsuit, a very serious lawsuit that we must contend with, and you know, it's critical, especially for our students, our Hispano students. It's these are the very students that are named in this lawsuit, and so when this public education department is tasked, not just asked, but tasked to really hold accountable, ensure education is happening at the part of both at the family level and for the student, and at the district level and at the school level. There's an implication and a job that we need to do, and when funding is cut, that's another space or location of tension. So just considering all of those kind of spaces of how budget impacts the entirety or the span of the education system, I think is where what we're wrestling with right now.
And I so appreciate that, Deputy Secretary. As I lead into the next question, I do think it's important to note, you know, this tension, not just from the lawsuit and the difference between the public education department and local school districts, but also the tension between our appropriators, the legislature, and the executive, right? And so as I ask this next question, there's also a tension in what can be done by which branches when. And so recognizing that the legislature is a little bit constrained, they can only make law during legislative session. I wanted to ask, you know, given the challenges that Dr. Sanchez highlighted in his presentation, what ideas have you heard or seen, or are you working on, are you thinking of, to really get support for our Hispanic families and students as soon as possible? Because I think we all agree we can't necessarily wait for the next legislative session and hope that, you know, July 1st, when a new law would pass next year, we can solve all of these problems. Are there ideas of what we could do immediately to make sure we're providing support?
Sure, there is. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is a program with the national partner called Graduation Alliance that we piloted, stood up last spring during continuous learning time. So, and I'm calling it continuous learning because that's what we coined the span of time where there was school closure, school building closure really, but we wanted to ensure that seniors had the ability to graduate and that school was still in session in a remote space last spring. So it was continuous learning time. Immediately within a week of continuous learning plans from the different districts and charters, we saw that big issue, you know, I noticed right away it was going to be students who are falling off the radar, families who needed support immediately, students who are not engaging, students who are unmotivated. And it really came first from the space of seniors who we wanted to be able to get across the finish line, that we knew that this was going to be hugely impacting them right away. So this partner is a national organization that really actually has a depth of experience in adult education. And so we spoke with them and thought about how can we, they have a great expertise in terms of support systems for students who are kind of at risk that are young adults. So we thought about what we could do to stand up some sort of support structure with them. And it was a tiered approach where we paid for it from the public education department. And we asked all districts to flag, identify students immediately who may need those supports. Graduation Alliance had a whole host of kind of a two-pronged system. First was an outreach counselor who was doing immediate, really robust, vigorous outreach to the families and the students themselves. It was for any student within the span of 6th grade through 12th grade to see what were their needs. And then they did an intake, like, do you need technology support? Are you having issues with your laptop? Do you need counseling? Is there issues in terms of your family needing kind of food or food insecurity issues, right? Any and all of those things. And then from there, it was tiered in terms of the student simply needed a one touch thing, and then one touch, communications, just one issue, and then just some check-ins after. Or tier 2, more consistent ongoing support. And then there was a whole host of students who needed tier 3 support. And it ended up, we supported about little over 7,500 students in the spring with this project. The tier 3 supports, fascinatingly enough, the students needed accountability support the most, beyond technology, beyond counseling, beyond an adult who actually cared for them. And that was really fascinating data. We're actually the only state that has the depth of this data and there's many states who are now interested in looking at this program. But by accountability, what I mean is the daily check-ins. It's the work that you do as a teacher actually to really see, oh, the student did turn something in. How are you doing? Do you need any follow-up, right? So just having an outside academic coach to say, do you need tutoring? Do you want just me to follow up and say, what happened today? Let's try again tomorrow. Let's touch base tonight at 11 o'clock at night because you're actually helping your siblings during the day. So having the flexibility to support in that way. So we're going to look at rolling out that program now. We've started to work with districts to have that available, but we'd like to scale it, obviously.
Thank you. Senator, Representative, any ideas or thoughts from the legislative perspective about how we might be able to support families?
One of the problems we have as a legislature is, Amanda, you brought it up, is we're limited to what we can do when we're not in session. we're limited to our powers. And even if we do something, we have to pass the bill and get it through, do either an emergency clause or have it be effective in July. One of the frustrating parts is ever since I've been elected, and me and Senator Candelaria came in around the same time, is we've been talking about broadband, and we've been talking about a need for access. And we've had studies after studies. The PRC has done studies, and the legislature has done studies, and the school districts have done studies. And it's been talk. And we just keep having these conversations that really aren't getting anywhere. And now we're in a national crisis. And so these are things that, we hopefully, if anything comes out of this, we actually start doing what we say we're going to do as legislators and stop the talk and actually get stuff done. The lack of broadband, the lack of internet is extremely crucial right now. I also sit on the Science and Tech Committee, and we got a presentation last week, and the Clovis School District spent $35,000 a month on these mobile vans creating hotspots in neighborhoods. And now I don't know where the money came from. I don't know how the spending is going, but is that working for every school district? Is that something that we can do for every school district? These are real conversations we need to be having, because I don't see, I know HPS, they're not going back to school till January. My school district's a little bit different, but these are real conversations, and we really need to come up with some real solutions, and make it happen. It's just, I'm tired of the talk, I'll be honest with you.
So I think I want to focus in on some of the issues that Dr. Sanchez identified in the polling, which I thought was incredibly timely and very helpful to understand a lot of these issues from a New Mexico perspective. One of the issues I want to raise is, I think that, as we know, this pandemic has shown how economically fragile many of our families in the Hispanic community are, and it is not for want of hard work. I think we all know hard work and working hard for your family and providing for a better future is something ingrained in our culture. It's ingrained in all of us who are born and raised here. You take care of your family and your own. But I think we need to have a clear realization of just how unequal and how at basically on the edge so many of our families live. And going into the next session, I think that needs to directly inform the policy conversations we have, because I agree with the representative on a number of these issues. It's that we lack the political will. It's not that there's not a way forward or people can't figure out ways to fix these problems, but I think we need to have a real conversation, right? The representative identified one area of an inequality, right? Access to digital technology, to the internet, which is perhaps, we're seeing now, the greatest discriminatory factor in our modern economy, right? We're essentially seeing two different economies play out. One is a service-based economy that's very exposed to COVID, to lockdown, and et cetera. And the other is a virtual economy that really isn't, and actually is doing incredibly well. Apple, for example, added, I think, $500 billion in value since March, and is now going to tip $2 trillion in valuation by the end of this quarter, at a time where the economy many of us live in is just completely in tatters. So I think understanding how our economy has fundamentally shifted, and whether or not a lot of the decisions we've made in the past, when it comes to taxation, when it comes to many sort of decisions in the past, the minimum wage and others, access to healthcare, access to childcare, those are going to be very important questions. I think it's going to be challenging to find political common ground on a lot of those, but we will see. I think there are issues we should be able to find common ground. Broadband is one of them. But another issue that I think was highlighted for me recently is, we talk about broadband, and there are still many parts of New Mexico, especially on the Navajo reservation, that don't have access to clean running water or to electricity in the year 2020. That seems to me a problem that we should be able to solve in a year, right? I really don't understand why we still have that problem. And so I agree with the representative. Now is probably a good time to start asking the very accountability questions and start really emphasizing, well, why and what are you going to do to do something better about it? But beyond the immediate need, I think there are, as I've said, some fundamental questions that we need to grapple with as a state that are very uncomfortable. And I think that's because they have to do with issues of poverty and race and imperialism and oppression and violence and substance abuse and addiction. But until we really start grappling with those issues and addressing them front on, I think a lot of what we do is just sort of window dressing in the end.
Speaking of places that it's hard to find a middle ground, I think, you know, as we've looked to the return to school, I will say, as someone who pays attention to this conversation every minute of every day, there was a pretty dynamic shift in the way that we were talking about that, the way that we were planning for it. And I think, you know, for reasons that are out of our hands, but I will just say, one of the things that speaks to me from Dr. Sanchez's presentation is we've always known this. I think all of our panelists would agree, and if you don't, please weigh in, but there isn't really a one size fits all approach for education. Our students come from different backgrounds, they have different needs, their families have different needs, and more than ever, we're seeing that to be true. So are there ideas or thoughts around how we make sure that every family has what they need to survive a school year that is going to look very different than any other school year? We can make plans for January, we can make plans for May, but I think to some extent we have to plan for everything at this point. So just looking for ideas and thoughts around how do we make sure that people have access to what they need to get through this academic year, and options that help them reach that goal.
Okay, I'll go first. Great question, Amanda. You know, the first thing that I'm gonna say is that we're asking, so the public education department, the way that we're approaching this for every district and charter school is that they have to complete an assurances document towards reentry. And so what that means is they sign off on the requirements that we have set forward in terms of what will reentry look like. There's 8 major requirements, but then there's an entire kind of comprehensive 25-page guidance document. And in addition to that, there's, I think, over 30 guidance documents now around different topics like attendance or at-risk students, bilingual education, those types of things. So the districts and charters sign off on this assurances document. In addition, they submit their plan for reentry in a remote environment. And that plan asks a whole host of questions around how are you supporting attendance? How are you supporting your grading and communication with parents and families around feedback in daily and weekly basis? How are you supporting special ed students with special needs? How are you continuing your bilingual programming in this environment? How are you continuing dual credit in this environment? Like it's really expansive, right? And then in addition, there's a whole section on social emotional well-being and ensuring that for students and families, and a section on family and community communications and collaboration. So that's one thing. I think in terms of just our role as a state, SEA, State Education Agency, in ensuring and that accountability for districts that they're actually attending to all of this. And it's been a really drawn out, heavy, intensive process over the past kind of month and a half, and we're not done just in terms of really still continuing to do that work and really work hand on hand and provide solid technical assistance to a lot of those districts. In particular, I'm concerned about a lot of our rural communities. So the small rural districts, I'm just working heavily with many of them to ensure that everything is, you know, from COVID safe practices to curriculum to the technology, all of those pieces are in place, because it's overwhelming, particularly when you don't have a team. So that would be one thing. And I think that in that, Amanda, that notion of options, we have also asked them to have a remote learning opportunity available at any point during the year for all families. So every single charter, every single school district has to have a remote learning plan in place and a remote learning mechanism for families should they so choose to have that in place. And that also includes kind of the technical support around technology. So one thing about technology is we don't really consider that it's actually kind of like a four-pronged piece of devices and connectivity. Those are the two big pieces, right, that we always default to. But the third is the professional development supports for any and all educators who are involved in technology and knowing how to articulate, support their families with that, use it effectively, pedagogically and or technically. And then the fourth, really, really, really important piece is the training and support for families in technology, right? And the technical support that needs to happen. What if I can't log onto my device? How are you connecting and supporting families with that? So I would say that's just a quick snapshot.
Thank you. And I'll reframe a little bit for Senator Conrad-Avia and Representative Fajardo. Maybe since you don't get to interact with districts every day and kind of make sure they're complying with state law or regulations, what are you hearing from your superintendents? What are you hearing from your constituents around, what they're looking for, what they might need in the year ahead? And one thing that Dr. Warner-Perea said that I want to highlight, the APS, we saw them pivot, given that this is United Way of Central New Mexico. APS plays a major role in Central New Mexico. Originally, their plan for online instruction was you have to enroll in E-Academy. And I think it sounds like they're being responsive to the community and saying, if I want to do virtual, I still want to do it at my home school. I want to do it at whatever district assigned elementary, middle, or high school I would normally go to. And it sounds like they're going to make that pivot. So want to give them a shout out for that, being adaptive in the environment. But Representative, Senator, what are you hearing? What are your superintendents saying? What's your community saying?
So this is a great question. So I think it sounds like a broken record, and I hate to do it, but it's that technology, that IT aspect. My daughter-in-law is actually a teacher down in Valencia County, and she spent over an hour with the grandma trying to explain how to get on Zoom, how this is going to work. And so, there's a huge lack of IT support, a huge lack of teacher support. Here's, my daughter-in-law she's responsible for teaching the entire classroom. Her classroom is actually in her closet at the house so that she can have quiet as she's teaching. So there's a lot of resources that the teachers aren't getting right now. She's not getting support for, in order to help with this grandma and spend an entire hour how Zoom works, because we know that especially in high poverty areas or just about any area, you have a lot of the grandparents raising the kids, and there's a technology gap there that exists. A few years ago, I have Ann Parish in my school district, which is in the Meadow Lake area. They got a huge Apple grant, and Apple came in and totally revamped the entire school. They put in Apple computers and put in the software and these cool little displays, super cool stuff. And every kid got an iPad. The problem is those kids were not allowed to take those iPads home because of the area they lived in. Uncle or somebody would probably take that iPad and sell it for drugs. That's the world they're living in. And so there's a technology gap for a lot of these kids. And those are the frustrations that I think we're going to see moving forward. You have some kids who are going to figure this out and they're going to do well because their parents are hiring tutors, because they're in pods, these group pods that are developing with parents, all these things. And my biggest fear is you're going to have an entire group of kids that are 6 months to a year behind. And we need to think about that now on how we're going to get them up to speed. And we need to start going into the school districts, asking what they need. And I hate to say it, the politicians need to kind of get our noses out of it and let the school districts tell us what they need. And we need to be more receptive of that. Because Morgan, you said, Amanda, sorry, you said it perfectly. Every school is different. And what JAL needs is different from what Belen needs, is different from what LaQuafa needs. And so we need to be more receptive of those things. And so there's just a huge lack of support. And I think the teachers are feeling frustrated because not only do they have to teach, but they have to be technologically sound. They need to learn how to Zoom or mute a kid. They need to pay attention. It's a complicated time. And I think we need more support on that end.
Senator, any thoughts?
No, I'll certainly agree. I mean, with a lot of that, the overarching refrain I've gotten from parents in my district is safety. And that is ultimately the concern that gets brought to me by parents. And, you know, I certainly agree with meeting districts where they are at on a number of these service delivery issues, meeting districts and parents where they are at in terms of ensuring that resources and supports are being properly tailored to really support student success. But for me, you know, I do draw a line in the sand on these issues when it does come to safety, right? And so I do think no matter how frustrating or contentious it may be, a statewide standard about safety, especially as schools do open up and return to school, to ensure that there are baseline sort of safety precautions being taken, is important, because ultimately a breakout in any school in the state poses a material threat to the entire state. Now, I will say, I certainly support what the representative is saying, which is to have more local input and local involvement in guiding the development of those sort of rules and procedures. But at the end of the day, we are one state, right? There are two competing values here: local control versus state policy. And that, I think, in the 8 years I've been in the legislature, has always been the tension. One of the tensions in our public education system. I think as we move forward, I think we need to start asking some very serious questions also about how our education system is structured. I don't think we need 89 school districts. I don't think we can afford it anymore. I don't think it's justifiable anymore. I think district consolidation is necessary for moving the state forward, period. There's a lot of good arguments on the local control side for why we need to have a superintendent making $100,000 a year when they have less than 50 students in their school district. But to me, that's a waste of public money. And that's money that could be used and redirected to better support those students. So, you know, there are some sticky questions that once you start peeling back that onion of that tension between state and local control, the part the state has to always remind folks about is, but the money always comes from the state. Santa Fe writes the check. And therein lies the problem, right? And so, you know, I think we're going to have to take a serious look at our practices, as the representative said. I fully agree with her. But I think there's also room for structural control, because, you know, if technology and distance learning, for example, becomes much more ingrained in our educational practices moving forward, that also raises question about higher education. I mean, we all know we have too many universities. So I'm just flagging for everybody. We've had the benefit of having this system that is the status quo for a long time, but it's just not, in my view, sustainable anymore.
Thank you for that, Senator. I know you commented about political will earlier, so I just want to highlight that I've often heard that idea about district consolidation mentioned in hushed tones in closed rooms, and just wanted to give you some credit for saying it out loud.
You know,
so
to your credit,
that.
I only had the courage to bring it up because John Arthur Smith brought it up. I think Kelly was there maybe at our last LFC meeting. And he mentioned that that's been a topic of conversation since Gary Carruthers was governor. And, you know, there's a lot of good reasons, and that's just one idea, right? That doing that's not going to solve our problems. But it's just one of these things where, you know, these are some sticky issues. And the problem we're going to have is a lot of our decisions are going to have to not pit, but are going to have to mean balancing really competing goods within a really difficult situation. And as Kelly said, putting families and local communities first in that conversation, I agree is important.
It's interesting. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Representative.
That issue of consolidation, I don't know how I feel about that. It's kind of, you know, that's a new thing for me. My concern with something like that, APS is such a monolith, and they are so huge, and everything that happens in the state is basically a decision by APS, and that doesn't always meet the rule needs. And so the only way something like that would work was that if you took the rest of this, you have to make it competitive, because decisions right now, and you know, because we have most of the legislators, you know, live in the APS school district and are in that area. Decisions are guided by APS, and those decisions affect the entire state, even though it's not relative to the entire state. So that would be an interesting conversation. I'm not saying I'm opposed or I agree to it, but you would have to make sure, and you know, this kind of, you know, Jacob knows as well as I do, capital outlay is always a big issue. You know, you don't want to ignore the rural school districts. You want to make sure they have their needs taken care of. So I think that is going to be the same kind of debate. I could be wrong, but let's see if that conversation continues to come up.
And certainly one of the reasons that you were both selected for this panel is we view you as two people that are willing to come to the table and have hard discussions. So we appreciate that. Dr. Sanchez, I wanted to go back to you for a second, because I think embedded in your poll are some ideas about what we could be doing for Hispanic families and students right now. So do you have anything to weigh in on?
Yeah, just briefly, I'll hit on a few data points. Some of it is unfortunate to do polling across so many different aspects of our systems in the state. It's a little easier for me to see the connection points. And I think something, Amanda, that you started the questions with, which was looking at policy solutions that aren't just narrowly siloed on education. And I think the more we think about policy reform from a comprehensive standpoint, and usually we don't think about education reforms using the family as the unit of analysis. We think about the kids for good reason. But a couple of sobering statistics from this survey that I presented on that I didn't have time to share with you, 20% of respondents indicated that they had been laid off. And that was in early June. I've done some work for Workforce Solutions. Those of you that are tracking these numbers know we're at about 150,000 unemployed. Most of those folks are parents. So we need to be thinking about this in a comprehensive way, right? Most of the data and literature in terms of education outcomes focuses on the parents' stability with their workforce environment being central to those education outcomes. So if we're not thinking about trying to fix all these other systems and we're only looking at the downstream factors on education, we'll miss an opportunity. And I say opportunity because all the polling I've done, whether it's on transition to clean energy, for example, whether it's in the education space, New Mexican voters right now are very open to very aggressive and outside the box policy solutions, much more so than I'm used to seeing. And I think it's because everybody recognizes we're in a very difficult economic time for the state, and folks are going to give legislators, governor, et cetera, a lot more latitude to try some creative approaches. So we need to be thinking big like that. Very, very big picture, systems level changes. If not, I'm afraid I'll be having the same conversation with a different set of audience members in 20 years with the same outcomes that we've seen 20 years ago when I was a kid. So I think we really need to be thinking about structural level shifts, whether that's specifically in the education system or across the board at a really critical opportunity time when I think voters are going to be willing to allow folks to take some shots that they might not ordinarily let us do.
Thank you, Dr. Sanchez. Always a learning opportunity. I always want people to get off not having heard different opinions, but having learned something as well. And so one thing that I'll tee up that I think was key between the discussion between our two esteemed legislators is New Mexico has a very unique way of funding education. It's not as locally driven and not as district driven as we see in other states. We are pretty progressive in making sure that the funding is as equitable as possible per kid. So when Senator Candelaria says Santa Fe writes the check, we take all of the state money and put it in one bucket and then equalize it out per student based on student needs and characteristics for the districts. That's very different than how it works in other states. So that local dynamic that we see in other places of we're going to call the shots because it's our local money isn't necessarily at play in New Mexico, because it's state money being sent to a kid in Jow the same way it's sent to a kid in Shiprock. So I just wanted to highlight that for everyone, because I do think it's really important as we navigate these conversations. And as we lead into this next question, I don't think anyone on this call, like Dr. Sanchez, wants to be having this conversation in 20 years. And so when we look at things like the Martinez-Yazzie lawsuit, when we look at the glaring, what I call an opportunity gap, because our Hispanic students can't achieve at the same levels of other kids when given the opportunity. For our three panelists, how do we make sure that there's someone looking out for our Hispanic students, and that we are not in this position 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road? And so more pointedly, what's the outlook for Hispanic student progress over the next 5 years? Where do you think we'll be, and how can we get there?
First, I want to thank Dr. Sanchez for what he said about talking about how just not looking at the outcomes of education, but looking at the entire family approach, because he nailed it. I mean, he totally nailed it. When you have kids who are dealing with things at home, learning makes it more difficult. When you're dealing with poverty, when you're dealing with not being able to eat, when you're dealing with certain family dynamics like abuse and things like that, that is a huge problem, and they're not getting the support. So it is an all-encompassing approach. Maybe the worst thing in history may become the best thing in history. I don't know. But, we keep talking about the outcomes of education, and, the lawsuit, is a perfect example. The legislator, us as a legislature, we added more money, we said, okay, we're going to promote some more money, and here's the fix. And they came back and said, we didn't ask for money, we asked for solutions. And we need to stop throwing money at the problem and start going to the communities and asking what the solutions are. And I go back to what each community needs. What are their needs? In a rural district, finding after-school care, finding child care, finding these things that help support the family are harder to come by than an urban area. So maybe we need to divide that money separately. I agree that our funding formula is cutting edge the way we do it as a state. But we have to think a little bit more about meeting the needs of the school district and what that looks like. Behavioral health is a huge issue. Alcoholism is a huge issue. Abuse, poverty is a huge issue. We need to deal with these outliers to get kids educated. Do we need to create more programs? I don't know. Do we need to hold CYFD more accountable? Do we need to create ombudsmen's positions within the PED or within CYFD or something like that to bring more accountability so the things we're giving money to are actually happening? Those are big questions, but I agree with Senator Candelaria. We lack the political willpower to do things sometimes because it's easier to kick the can down the road. I mean, we've looked at our tax structure in this state for years. Everybody can agree our tax structure is a mess. It needs to be revamped, but nobody has the political willpower to make a difference or to do something about it. But I think right now we're at a point where we're going to have to make some real changes. If we don't do something, we're going to have an entire generation of kids that are behind. And I haven't read the study myself, but it was brought to my attention. And they told me to read the study after Hurricane Katrina. And you have an entire generation of kids who missed one school year. Just one school year, but the second generation is still dealing with that lack of education. It's becoming a heritage problem. And we need to make sure that as we move forward, we're not dealing with that. I mean, if we're going to be progressive and cutting edge on our school funding formula, maybe New Mexico can be cutting and edge on how we deal with these issues of getting our kids educated so we're not making the same mistakes that happened in New Orleans.
Thank you, Representative.
Did our secretary want to go? This is kind of your bailiwick.
Thank you, Senator. You can close this out. There are 4 things that I think of immediately in terms of what I hope for our state and for our Hispano Latino Chicano students in New Mexico. And I get emotional, right? Because it's us, it's our gente. So the first is actually the pipeline. We need teachers who look like us and who are strong and right. We need to support our pipeline. And that doesn't just mean teachers, it means our early childhood educators, and it means our counselors, and it means our social workers, and it means our school nurses, and it means our principals. We need to really support our education leaders. We need systems and programs that do that, because that is part of the generational work of education systems. And we haven't had as much attention to that. And in particular, our Hispano education leaders and educators in general. When I say educators, it's all educators. What's important about that is not just the connectivity of identity from the student to the adult that's serving them, but the connection with your community. And I'll return to that with the last thing. So that would be first. The second is really the notion of the community school, and Representative Fajardo spoke beautifully about that, and so did, obviously Dr. Sanchez and his all of his amazing research that he did. Having this as a multi-generational approach really is meaningful for a whole host of reasons, not the least of which is there's very, very strong research out there that what impacts education is only 30% the classroom teacher, even though when you think about education, it's really the classroom teacher that most directly impacts success for the student. But 70% are outside indicators. Those are the things like food insecurity and what's happening for them at home and drug abuse, right? And substance abuse, all of those other things that, Representative was speaking about. And those other 70% of indicators impacting the education system, we need to contend with those in a comprehensive way. So funding community schools and looking at the community school model. United Way is wonderful about this, but I can't speak highly enough about this or more profoundly about why that is a new frame for an education system. And then third is rethinking what we think of as graduation. Maybe even entirely looking at statute, because right now our graduation system is modeled on an old, antiquated version of education. It's based on seat time. It's based on a whole host of rigmarole of that students have to kind of check off and mark the boxes and say they have to go to this many courses in math and this many courses in science and this many courses, right? I need a class that deals with the Constitution, right? It's a little check the box type model instead of looking at graduation in terms of you have a beautiful model in the profile, the graduate profile, and or connecting it with jobs, which would be much more robust. Like, how are we supporting and connecting, linking the education system with our economic development system in the state? So students graduate and there's a pathway for them. It's not necessarily about the back story of those course requirements, and instead is more aligned with the future and where they're going. And then last but not least, it's a little bit about the design of what it is and how it is we teach. And this is the space of culturally and linguistically relevant education, culturally and linguistically sustainable education, when we sustain our community and who we are and our identity. It's about leveraging our community resources and not just the space of, what we think of our national standards, and which are really important and an inherent civil right that students need to know how to read. They need to know how to do mathematics in an advanced way or in a way that's appropriate for them and their pathway towards success. but they also, right, there's validity in knowing the way that the SECI is run and those systems and the community that we are. So really taking a much more holistic approach to education, I think. This is our opportunity to do that and not just move entirely to an e-learning space that's removed from who we are.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary. Closing comments, Senator Candelaria?
No, I just want to thank you all for the conversation. I think the key takeaway is, we have the opportunities to sort of be timid in the face of our challenges, or to really be bold and to really exert generational style leadership. And that's what I think this moment calls for. Because while we have a lot of successes in this state, we, like any other state, are really called upon to do a better job. And those calls get very loud at times like this, when people rightfully turn towards government, which government is just all of us. This is how we govern ourselves. Government is not some evil thing out in the corner. It's our friends and neighbors who are elected to serve, right? It's all of us who are coming together to solve problems that are too big for any one of us to individually conquer. And so I hope that we will be brave. And I appreciate, Gabe, you giving me some courage that my voters are gonna give us a little bit more latitude. But hey, last session, in the special session, we took about $400 million from the land grant permanent fund to infuse that directly into the state economy. That's never been done before in state history. That's probably one example of something that we had to do in the moment to ensure that we were trying to stave off the decline in our state. It was bold, and I think we're seeing good results from it. And so for me, that's just an example. If we really are committed, it's really going to take embracing this moment full on. The worst thing we could do, I think, is be timid and just sort of get along to go along and just try to hobble our way to the next fiscal year with a balanced budget, and then hobble our way to the next fiscal year. That's how we got ourselves in this mess, is that sort of mentality. I think we need to think a little bolder. So I want to thank you all for letting me be part of this conversation today. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to our three panelists. Truly, we appreciate you carving time out of your days to hop on and have this conversation with us. Before I turn it over to Mark, I'm going to take a little bit of moderator privilege and just ask if you've heard something good, or there's someone you want to shout out, whether it's a grandmother or a teacher, or just something good happening in education in New Mexico, because I know this has been a heavy conversation, and it needs to be heavy because we all have a role to play. But if there's a little bit of a shout out and sparkle you can leave in the comments, just shout someone out, highlight something good happening in the community, so we have a little bit of optimism as we hop off this call. And Mark, I'll turn it over to you for closing remarks.
Thank you. Wow, what a great conversation this has been today. I want to thank today's moderator, Amanda Aragon, our guest speaker, Dr. Sanchez, and our panelists, Senator Candelaria, Representative Fajardo, and Deputy Secretary Perea Warneman. Most of all, I want to thank all of you, our wonderful HPS members and our new friends. If you're currently not an HPS member, I hope that you will consider becoming one and supporting our efforts in the Hispanic community. And so from our family to yours, we wish you well. We hope that you stay safe and that you are healthy during this pandemic. And I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.